Today is the 14th day of the month of Teves. We are beginning chapter 41 today, discussing the laws of Hamotzi, the blessing that we make on bread. Today we'll be doing paragraph 1 through paragraph 7. Paragraph 1. On bread made out of the 5 grains, which include wheat, barley, oat, spelt, and rye, we make a blessing of Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz, thank you God, who brings forth bread from the ground. After the meal is concluded, we then recite Birchat Hamazon, and after blessing for a meal which contains bread, we're going to learn about the rules and the laws of Birchat Hamazon in chapter 44. Items which are not bread, but are made out of those 5 grains, for example, cookies, cakes, crackers, etc., we'll discuss the laws of those items in chapter 48. Paragraph 2. We learned in last chapter the mitzvah, the different rules of washing our hands, Netilas Yadayim. We're supposed to make sure that there's no break between Netilas Yadayim and when we do the Hamotzi blessing and eating the bread. Obviously, there's going to be a few moments, at least a few seconds, but there shouldn't be any sort of interruption. This interruption means going on a walk somewhere, it means waiting an extended length of time, and it includes talking as well. We are allowed to answer amen. So, for example, if you wash your hands and now you're going to sit down at the table and you hear somebody else wash their hands right after you, they make the blessing on Netilas Yadayim, we could answer amen to their blessing. That's not considered an interruption. In addition, things that are related to the bread would not be considered an interruption. For example, if you ask somebody to bring the salt to the table because we're going to see down this soon that you're supposed to dip the bread into salt, so you ask somebody, can you please bring the salt shaker, or do you know where the salt is? That would not be considered an interruption. Still, it's better to not say it. If you could do it with motioning or something of that sort is better. But that, if you do say it, it would not be considered an interruption. Let's say somebody does say they do have a bona fide interruption. They say something totally random, unrelated to the bread, unrelated to the bracha of Hamotzi. Then what do? So they have to once again wash Netilas Yadayim. They have to do another hand washing, but they do not make another blessing on that hand washing. Paragraph 3. There's 2 conflicting things that we want to try accomplishing when we make the Hamotzi blessing on the bread. Number 1 is that we want it to be as short of a time as possible between making the blessing and taking the first bite. Based upon this, one might think that maybe you should cut up the loaf of bread or break off a little piece of the sandwich before making the blessing. On the other hand, we have another concept that when we make a blessing, we want to make it on the nicest part of the bread, or on a nicer bread, a nicer loaf of bread, or a nicer piece of bread. Therefore, we don't want to cut up this loaf or break off a little piece of bread because it's not as nice for the blessing to be on something small. If you can make a blessing, thanking God for something that's larger and nicer. So if you're doing the whole loaf of bread, then you're supposed to make the initial cut around it, not cut it in half totally, not cut off a piece totally, but do the majority of the cut that's needed to end up cutting off the bread. So it will remain one loaf, but it'll be very easy to cut off that last piece. What's considered one loaf? At what point do you say it's not 2 loaves that are just hanging on by a little piece of bread, but it's really considered 2 different pieces? Not 2 loaves at least, but 2 different pieces. If you cut it deeply enough that when you pick up one side, the other side will fall off of it, that's not considered 2 different pieces. That's not considered one loaf anymore. So you want to make a cut in it. You want to begin the cutting process, but you don't want to cut it so deep that if you pick up one side, the other side will fall off. So to summarize, the order is you wash your hands, you make the blessing of Netilas Yadayim, thanking God for the mitzvah of washing our hands. You dry your hands, you go to the table, you make a cut into the bread, not all the way through, but a significant portion of the way through. You then make the Hamotzi blessing, and then you finish cutting off the piece of the challah, and you take a bite of the bread. Now there's 2 exceptions to this cutting situation. Number 1, if you're dealing with a small roll or something very small, that it won't save any time really to make a slice. For example, I think a sandwich would cover that. If you bite into a sandwich, breaking off a little piece of sandwich won't make you start eating sooner after you make the blessing than if you don't break it off. So you don't have to worry about cutting the sandwich or anything of that sort in advance. Another exception is on Shabbos. On Shabbos, you have an extra mitzvah to make the blessing on 2 whole loaves of bread. And therefore, we have to be more careful that we're not getting anywhere close to chopping this bread in half before the blessing. So on Shabbos, the custom is to make a small little line with the knife, to make a small little cut, but nowhere near the size of the cut that we would make on a weekday. Paragraph 4. Ideally, immediately after you make the blessing of Hamotzi, you then eat at least a size of a kazayas of bread. A kazayas is approximately 1.6 fluid ounces, the volume of 0.6 fluid ounces to the volume of 1.1 fluid ounces. So have a nice size piece of bread. And if you're eating with other people, you should make sure that you're handing out slices of bread to them as well, the same size. Paragraph 5. When we make the blessing on the bread, we're supposed to hold the bread on both hands using all 10 of our fingers. All 10 fingertips should be on the bread. And the reason is because 10 is a very symbolic number in Judaism, specifically with regards to bread. It's symbolic in general. Think of the 10 commandments. You have other 10s. You need 10 people for a minyan. But specifically with regards to bread, there's extra significance. And that is because there's 10 mitzvahs that are involved in the production of bread. We'll just run through them quickly. The first one is, number 1, we're not allowed to plow a field with an ox and a donkey together. Number 2, we're not allowed to plant different types of seeds together, different types of grains together. Number 3, if a couple of ears of grain fall to the ground as we're harvesting, then there's a mitzvah called leket to leave that in the field for the poor. Number 5, there's a mitzvah called shikha. If we're bringing in all the bundles, the way that it works in ag culture, or at least the way it used to work, I don't know how it works nowadays, but they'd harvest everything and then they'd bundle it up in the field. So if a farmer was bringing in all the bundles of grain into his silo, and he forgot a bundle out in the field, there's a mitzvah to leave that bundle in the field for the poor. Number 5, another part of the field that we leave for the poor is mitzvah to leave what's called the mitzvah of peah, a corner of the field for the poor to be able to harvest and have for their own. Mitzvah number 6, when an ox is threshing a field, we're not allowed to muzzle the ox. It's not fair to the ox to be working with food and not allowed to be able to nibble on that food as well. Mitzvah number 7, we're supposed to give part of the crop we give to the Kohen. That's called truma. Mitzvah number 8 is called Ma'aser Rishon. We give a tenth of our crop to the Levite. Mitzvah number 9, the second tenth, we're supposed to either give it to the poor, or it depends on what year it is in the Shemitah cycle. Every 7 years, you have to let the land lay fallow, and we're not allowed to plant in it. That's called Shemitah. So some years the Shemitah cycle, with the second tenth of the crop we bring up to Jerusalem, we eat it in Jerusalem, and some years we give that second tenth of the crop to the poor. So that's called either Ma'aser Sheni, if it's the year that we bring it up to Jerusalem, a second tithe, or it's called Ma'aser Ani, the tithe for the poor, if it's that year that we leave it for the poor. And the 10th mitzvah that we have with the production of bread is the mitzvah of challah, from the dough. We take off a little piece of the dough and we give that to the Kohen as well. There's another reason why 10 is significant with regards to bread production. There's a verse in Psalms which says, the eyes all look to you with hope and you give them the food in its proper time, and that verse has 10 words. The verse in the book of Deuteronomy in Devarim, which talks about the 7 special species of the land of Israel, that verse also has 10 words in it. In the book of Genesis, Isaac gives a blessing to his son Jacob, to Yaakov, and the blessing that he says to him is, may God give you the dew of the heavens and the fatness of the earth and abundant grain and wine. That verse as well has 10 words in it. With all these 10 surrounding bread, surrounding sustenance, therefore, there's this custom that we make sure to hold the bread with all 10 fingers when we're making the blessing on the bread. In the blessing ends off, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. So the word lechem, which means bread, who brings forth bread from the ground, the word lechem, which means bread, is right before the word min, which means from. The word lechem ends in an M sound, and the word min starts with the M sound. So says the Shulchan Aruch, that M sound gets swallowed up. Those two words could become one word. Instead of saying lechem min, somebody might say lechemin. Therefore, he says to be careful to pause after the word lechem, after the word bread, before saying the word min, so you don't swallow up those two words and turn them into one word. Another letter which could get swallowed up easily, says the Shulchan Aruch, is the H sound at the beginning of hamotzi. Some might say motzi lechem in aretz, forgetting to not being careful about enunciating that ha motzi lechem in aretz. So we should be careful about it as well. And we should make sure that we're being very mindful as you say this blessing. Immediately after the blessing, we're supposed to take a bite from the bread right away, as soon as we can. And unlike between the blessing that we made when we washed our hands, the time period between making the blessing on washing the hands and sitting down to make the blessing on the bread, the blessing of hamotzi, over there I mentioned that if you hear somebody else make a blessing, you can answer amen to their blessing. That's not a problem to have an interruption like that between the blessing on the hands and the blessing on the hamotzi. But once you make the hamotzi blessing, you can't even answer amen until you take a bite from the challah or from the bread. So if you make your blessing on hamotzi, and as you're about to take a bite from the bread, somebody else makes a hamotzi or a different blessing, you can't answer amen. You have to first take a bite from the bread. Paragraph 8. After you make hamotzi, before you take a bite from the bread, we're supposed to dip the bread into salt. This is commonly known that we do this on Shabbos, but really we're supposed to do it every single time that we eat bread. Now, where does this come from? Why do we dip our bread into salt before taking a bite from it? So it goes back to the temple. Every offering that was brought on the altar had to have salt added to it. We don't have a temple or an altar nowadays. The altar effectuated atonement. If somebody did something wrong, one of the ways of repenting was to bring an offering on the altar at the temple. So how does somebody get that atonement nowadays without the temple? So first of all, there's an atonement process even without bringing an offering that we talked about when we went through the rules of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But another way that we get an atonement is by having guests at our table. Our table turns into an altar. When we have company at our table, when we celebrate Judaism around the table, we celebrate Shabbos, the holidays. These are all things that bring us atonement, and therefore our tables, they are the replacement for the altar. So just like the altar, every offering had to have salt, so too with our table, every time we sit down we have bread, we're supposed to dip it in salt before taking a bite. Paragraph 7. It's not appropriate to throw bread around. So therefore, when the person who's leading the meal, who made the blessing on the bread, after they cut up the challah, they shouldn't be throwing the pieces to people at the table. They should be handing it to them. But even handing them is really a problem, because when somebody's a mourner, there's a custom to hand them the bread directly from your hand to their hand. So therefore, we don't actually hand the bread directly to the person when we're sitting at a table and having a meal together. Instead, we put it down in front of them. We'll put it onto a challah tray, onto a bread tray, and then pass the bread tray around so everyone can take their own piece. But we're not supposed to hand it directly to the person. This concludes today's episode. Have a wonderful day and see you tomorrow.